This is 7 Daughters and 7 Sons, Part 1, Chapter 2. Spring passed into summer. Summer turned into autumn. Then came winter and the rain. Every morning my uncle came to visit my father in my father's little shop. Of course, I was never there, but I knew what took place. My father told me. It was always the same. "Good morning, O father of girls," my uncle would greet him with a sneer. "How do you feel today, Abu al-Banat?" And then he would talk about the shipment of silks and spices he had just received from Hassan, or the packet of gold Ali had dispatched through a trusted messenger. "God has blessed me beyond my deserving," he would always continue. "It's a wonderful thing to be the father of sons. Because of them, I prosper beyond my wildest dreams." As if it were an afterthought, he'd add, "And how are your beautiful daughters, O my brother? Have you found husbands for any of them yet?" He would laugh with a pretense of good humor. "If you don't find husbands for them soon, they'll be too old. Even the garbage collectors won't want them." All my father ever said in reply was, "My 7 daughters make my house like paradise. God has blessed me too, O brother. May he continue to shower his bounty upon you and your sons all your days." "Oh, he will," my uncle would answer complacently. "Why shouldn't he? Things will get better for you someday. Wait and see. Wait and see." One by one, my cousins left Baghdad for other cities. After the disaster of Hassan's farewell to my father, the other boys didn't come to our house prior to their departures. They said goodbye at the shop, which suited my mother very well. There my father served them yogurt and water, but he wasn't expected to give them anything to eat. He never again mentioned the wisdom of their marrying before they left Baghdad, and they were all bachelors, as we were maids. According to my uncle, he was positively besieged by matchmakers and eager parents offering brides for his son. He didn't neglect to describe every one of them to my father in endless detail. "The girl is as beautiful as the sun and as rich as Croesus, but Ibrahim, or Hassan, or Ali, doesn't wish to marry until he's made all the money he can in Sidon, or Alexandria, or Cyprus, and comes back to Baghdad. It wouldn't be kind to take the girl so far from her family. Besides, you know these young bucks," he'd add with a wink. "They need a chance to kick up their heels a little bit if they are to make good husbands like you and me when the time is right." Once again, spring came. Once again, the scent of jasmine filled our courtyard. Once again, my father and I sat in the deepening dusk, playing chess. "Check," I cried. "Check and mate." I lifted my eyes from the board and peered at him through the dimness. "Father, what is the matter with you tonight? You haven't paid any attention to this game at all. That is why I won so easily." "You always win," he said. Only this time there wasn't a hint in his voice of the secret pride he took in my skill, only a deep melancholy. "What difference does it make if you win with difficulty or easily? And of what use are all your victories?" I went to him, kneeling beside him and taking his hand in mine. "Oh, my father, my beloved father, please tell me what's troubling you. Please tell me why you are so sad." "It's nothing, my child," he replied gently. "Nothing. Your uncle came to the shop today, as he always does. He bragged about his sons and his wealth, as he always does. Nothing is any different today from any other day. And that's the trouble, I guessed. You're very wise, Boran, he said. You should have been born a man. Yes, I replied, letting out a little of the bitterness that had festered inside of me for as long as I could remember. If I were a man, I could help you. I could help my sisters. I could help myself. You know I'm as able as any man. It isn't fair. My being born a girl was a mistake. It wouldn't have been a mistake 300 years before, or 200 years before, or even 100 years before. I'd learned that from the books my father borrowed from my uncle and let me read, too. Had not Scheherazade kept herself alive through 1,001 nights by virtue of her cleverness and knowledge to become the beloved and long-lived queen of the Sultan Shirir? Had not Boran, for whom I was named, influenced the policies of the Caliph himself? Once, women had been musicians, scholars, warriors, poets, and merchants. But the descendants of the caliphs who founded Baghdad forgot their desert heritage. Addicted to nothing but luxury, they permitted actual power to fall into the hands of Persian conquerors, who brought with them their own customs, including the hijab, the veil for women. It was their way of distinguishing free women from concubines. Turks had followed Persians, but the veil remained. In the end, of course, all women wore it, and none of them were free. Perhaps my father had guessed my thoughts. After all, he read the same books I did. He withdrew his hand from mine and patted my head. Only the young expect life to be fair, he said. But I love you just the way you are. I wouldn't want you to be anyone but my Boran. I'm only trying to say that if you were a man, I wouldn't have to worry about you so much. That's all. You don't have to worry about me now, I answered quietly. Surrounded by the darkness so that he couldn't see my face, nor I his, I was ready to tell him about my secret dream. But the moment passed. Abruptly, he stood up. I certainly do have to worry about you, he said, almost angrily. I have to worry about you, and Fatima, and Zainab, and Khalida, and Sharifa, and Amina, and little Darira. Rapidly, he paced from one side of the little courtyard to the other. What's to become of you? When I die, who will take care of you? I have nothing to leave you. I can't afford to ensure you decent husbands. So far, I've resisted the inevitable. I haven't let you go in marriage to men who are not good enough for you. I haven't sent you to be servants in other people's houses. But when I die, how are you going to avoid those fates? As suddenly as he had risen, he sat down again. Oh, my daughter, he sighed. Forgive me. I hadn't meant to speak to you of such things. I didn't want to spoil the even tenor of your days. I wanted you to be content and cheerful for as long as possible. He, who knew me so well, didn't know me at all. Oh, Father, I murmured, I'm not content, and I'm not cheerful. You and my mother don't have to carry this burden alone. I think about the future, my future too, and my sister's. I think about it often. I worry about it. I know what the situation is. What made you imagine I didn't? You understand too much, Boran. No, I cried. No. If I didn't know the truth, what could I do to help? What can you do to help anyway? My father replied quietly. so it would be better if you didn't know." "Even my sisters know," I said. "Even they think about it and worry about it." It was my turn to stand up. I moved a little away from him and turned to confront him, though I couldn't see the expression on his face. "As for me," I said, "I've thought about it so much that I've even come up with a solution." Now he would listen. Now I would tell him my secret dream. "A solution?" he said. "What kind of solution?" "The only solution is to beg from your uncle." I'd do it too, no matter how much it hurt to swallow my pride, if I thought there was any hope of help from that quarter. But since there isn't, I don't need to humiliate myself. "Calm yourself, Father," I said. "I'll go in and get a lamp." I entered the house. The night was warm for so early in the season, and my sisters had gone up to the roof to catch the breeze. My mother was alone in the room. "Come out with me, my mother," I said. "I want you to hear what I am about to say to my father." "I haven't time for chit-chat," my mother said impatiently. But I picked up the lamp from the low table on which it was set. It was the only lamp in the room. My mother had no choice but to follow me through the Iwan into the courtyard. I placed the lamp on the chess table. I sat on the mat of woven date leaves between my father and my mother, my knees drawn up and my arms around them. I felt that I would have the courage to say what I was going to say if I held on to myself. "Well," said my mother, "what's this all about? It had better be something important for you to take my lamp from me while I was sewing." But she was sewing still, having scarcely lost a stitch in the move from the house to the court. "Boran thinks she can find wedding money for herself and her sisters," my father said dryly. "I can't think how except by selling herself. I'd kill her before I'd let her do that." "And I'd kill myself before I'd do anything dishonorable," I assured him. "Well, all that goes without saying," my ever-practical mother said. She had no use for dreams or philosophy. "We know, Boran, what's not to be done. Now you may tell us what is to be done." Her voice was hard with sarcasm. It didn't surprise her, as it had my father, that I knew of their worries. She and I talked of little else. Still, I had never said to her what I was now about to say. "Oh, my father, oh, my mother, you know that I am as clever as my cousins." "Far cleverer," my mother responded with a shrug. "So what good does it do you? What can you buy with clever?" "Clever can get us what we need," I returned, careful to keep my voice and my eyes respectful. "Father, you have a little bit of money hidden away, just a small amount. You've told me that." My father nodded. "It's for your mother. When I go, at least she will be provided for." "Risk it, Father. Risk it," I urged. "It'll be no risk." "In what do you want me to invest it, my child?" he asked. "I've thought of it, but I haven't discovered anything safe enough. I don't dare lose it. Your mother and I have gone to bed with an empty stomach more than one night in order to accumulate even such a tiny store." "Invest it in me, Father," I whispered. His eyes narrowed, his forehead creased with a frown. "Boran, what do you mean?" Now we had come to the kernel. My hands were shaking, but I clasped them so tightly no one could see that. I made my voice strong and firm. "I want to do what my cousins have done. I've always dreamed of it. I'm as smart as they are. Send me to one of the cities along the coast. With the money, I'll set up shop. Those seaports are full of sailors. They sell their goods cheap, they're so eager to get rid of them. And merchants come on caravan, just as eager to buy. I'll send what I make to you. You'll be rich in a few months' time. My uncle will be as nothing compared to you. At first, my parents were so flabbergasted they couldn't speak. That's why I was able to say so much without being interrupted. My mother recovered her voice first. Tomorrow I'll send for that old woman who lives in the Muqtadiya district. She makes a secret broth from a certain herb she finds in the desert. It's said to cure madness. Mother, I'm not mad. Yes, you are. She spoke as calmly as if she were discussing the purchase of a cooking pot. If the old woman's elixir can't cure you, your sisters and I will raise a great lamentation and rend our clothing, mourning for your lost reason. Mother, listen to me. I'm not mad. She opened her mouth to speak again, but my father said sharply, Be quiet, wife. Then he said to me, You are not mad, Boran, but like me, you are a dreamer. You dream of things that cannot be. My mother couldn't be silenced for long. Women don't go into business. She uttered the words like a pronouncement. They sell vegetables in the bazaar, I pointed out. I see them every time I go there. If they must, if their husbands or fathers can't support them, but they're certainly not merchants or traders like your uncles and his sons. In the history of the world, such a thing has never happened. Oh, my mother, that's not true, I protested. Things were different once, and they don't have to be the way they are now forever. We don't live in some other place or some other time, she retorted. We live here and now. Here and now, where one of his daughters in the souk would be a disgrace to your father. He can scarcely hold his head up as it is. It'll only be a disgrace if I fail, I said. I will not fail. My mother turned to my father. You could beat her, she said. If the old woman's elixir doesn't work, you could beat her. Beating is one of the best methods for driving out evil spirits. I acted as if I hadn't heard her. No one need even know, I said. I'm thin. My breasts are small. I'll dress as a young man. I'll take a man's name. It'll be a secret between the three of us. And your sisters? What will we say to your sisters? My father asked. I felt a stab of joy in my heart when I heard those words. He was talking now as if the idea was something other than a dream, as if it was a matter to be seriously considered, its virtues and flaws to be carefully weighed. His question gave it reality. You'll tell them I'm going to be a servant in a rich man's house. You can tell that to my uncle, too, if you want. A disgrace, my mother moaned. Honest work isn't a disgrace, my father remonstrated. But she won't be doing honest work, my mother pointed out. What I'm really doing is just what no one will know, I said, and it will be honest work. Just because a thing hasn't been done doesn't mean it isn't honest. It's out of the question, my father said. It's totally and absolutely out of the question. But father, I cried, you can't mean that. You just said... He shook his head. We won't speak of it again. Please, father. He stood up. Boran, you're pushing me too far. If you don't keep quiet, I'll do as your mother suggested. I'll beat you. Don't ever mention this matter again. I've indulged you in every wild fancy all your life. I can see how that was a mistake. From now on, you'll tend to your sewing and your baking and your weaving like a good girl. He put his hand on my mother's shoulders. Come, wife, it's time for us to go to bed. She rose, too. They crossed the courtyard and entered the Iwan. My mother turned in the arch and said, Bring in the lamp, Baran, and put it out. That was all. Not even, Sleep well, my child. The next week was the worst of my life. Nothing before or after was ever as bleak or as hopeless as that time during which my father withdrew himself from me. There was nothing in me or in my surroundings to make up for the absence of his companionship. We didn't play chess. We didn't read together the ancient tales of jinns and magic carpets and the dusty volumes he borrowed from my uncle. We didn't sit in the courtyard in the twilight talking about what had gone on that day in his shop, while he fingered his beads and I ground spices in my mother's mortar. If he had had a son, he would never have talked to me about business, or read stories to me, or taught me chess. I would never have known what I was missing. But to have my life's greatest pleasure snatched away from me, suddenly and unjustly, and with no promise of its return, was more than I could bear. I raged and I wept, but only inside of myself where no one could see. My sisters had no idea of what I had lost. My mother had no sympathy for it. As for my father, I couldn't talk to him. He didn't reply to any words of mine. He greeted me in the morning as he greeted all the others, and he wished me a good night as he wished all the others. That was all. Then something worse happened. He became ill. A fever laid him low, and for 2 weeks my mother, Fatima, and Zainab took turns nursing him. I wasn't invited to assist them, and my father didn't ask for me. They bought herbs with which to brew healing broths and potions, but when their mixtures did no good, they sent for my uncle. He paid a barber to come. Naturally, he wasn't the best barber in Baghdad. His leeches and unguents proved of no use either. My uncle suggested that we take my father to Al-Maristan, the hospital, which cost nothing. My father refused to go. If I die, let me die among those I love, he said. The fever simply had to run its course, and the fact that it left my father no worse than pale and weak was due entirely to the care of my mother, Fatima, and Zainab. Day and night they sponged his body with cool water. They spooned hot soup down his unwilling throat. They wrapped him in piles of blankets when he shivered, and unwrapped him again when he grew warm. Thus the fever did no permanent damage to his mind or to his senses. In time, his strength would return, and he would be as he had been. But meanwhile, he sat in the courtyard in the shade from the narrow roof that extended a little bit beyond the house. He nibbled at the jellies and the boiled chicken my mother prepared to tempt his sadly diminished appetite. Every day, my uncle called at our house to inquire how he did. I wished he wouldn't come. I don't know what they spoke about. I was, of course, indoors at the time, and I'd given up the habit of eavesdropping. But I did know that his visits always left my father depressed and unhappy, making his recovery slower than it had to be. One day, after my uncle left, my mother dispatched Zainab into the court to sit with my father, to tend him, to fetch what he needed, and to keep him company. In another time, that would have been my task. But Zainab wasn't with him very long. A few minutes after she'd gone out, she came back into the house. "My father wants boron," she said. "I don't know why." She sounded put out. She knew I was in disgrace, though she didn't know the reason, and she had enjoyed her new role as my replacement. If things kept on as they had been going just before my father fell ill, in time, he might teach her to read and write, as he had taught me. If I was to return to favor, she would lose her chance. She was the only one beside me who wanted it. But my father had asked for me, and she was forced to carry the message. I hurried out into the courtyard as soon as she had spoken. A few cushions had been arranged against the wall of the house. His head rested against them, and his eyes, deep in gray sockets, were shut. If he was actually sleeping, I didn't want to disturb him. He needed rest. When I stood next to him, I whispered softly, "Oh, my father." He wasn't asleep. His eyelids flew open. "Boron," he said quietly. His hand reached for mine. "Sit down beside me." He spoke as if there had never been any difficulty between us. At first, after I had seated myself next to him, he didn't say anything. His eyes just examined my face for a long time. It was as if by looking at me, he thought he could ferret out the truth of my soul. Perhaps he could. At last he spoke. "Boron, I have made up my mind. I have no choice but to follow your suggestion." "Oh, my father!" I exclaimed, but he held up his hand, bidding me be silent. "Your mother remains very much against the whole idea," he said. "But that is neither here nor there. She can't prevent your going. Only I can do that, and I'll no longer stand in your way." He shook his head slowly. "Not that I want you to go. I think it is the scheme of a madwoman. I think I'll never see you again. But what else am I to do? It's our only chance. We have nothing to lose, except you." "No, father. I'll come back to you dressed in silks and jewels. Wait and see." I was exultant. I was sure. I knew that God was with me. "No one knows his kismet, Boron," he warned. "No one knows his fate. Do you see how I was struck down when I least expected it? I, who never before had suffered from so much as a headache. The next time, perhaps, I won't recover." "Father," I begged, "don't speak of such things." "Why not, Boron?" he asked. "You're the one who's so keen to face the truth. Which one of us can foresee the future? I thought I had time, but maybe I don't." His voice was low and intense. "Perhaps God inflicted this illness upon me. Perhaps he wants me to understand the fragility of any man's hold on life. I can't even count on myself to provide for you while I'm still alive. The shop has been closed for 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, I haven't brought a single dirham into this house. Suppose I was permanently disabled in some way. That would be worse than my dying. You would have the added burden of taking care of me." I didn't contradict what he was saying. It was true, and his realization of it was what had persuaded him to give me my chance. He lifted his hand and pointed to the corner where the house met the wall. "If you kneel there," he said, "and feel about with your hands, you'll discover a loose brick. Lift up the brick and bring me what you find." I did as he instructed. Beneath the brick, I discovered a little pouch of worn, dark leather. I carried it to him and put it in his hand. He pulled on the drawstrings to open it. "Hold out your palms," he said. I made a cup of them, and he poured out the contents of the little bag. "Count them," he instructed. I counted them. "How much is there?" he asked. 15 dinars and 7 dirhams, I replied. He nodded. "We had 16 dinars before I got sick. Your mother broke one to buy the expensive tidbits she thinks I need. What's left of it will last a while yet, until I'm back at the shop. You'll take what's here with you." He ran his fingers through the little pile on my lap. "So few," he sighed. "So few for a lifetime's labor. Not enough to do any of us any good. From such a scrawny pile, I couldn't even make decent weddings for the lot of you, let alone marriage gifts sufficient for a respectable match." "It's enough, Father," I said. "It's enough. It will come back to you 1,000 times." Carefully, I slipped each coin into the bag. I pulled the drawstrings tight, and then I dropped the bag into the pocket of my sarwal, my trousers. Later, after my sisters had gone to bed, and my father had fallen into the light, easy sleep of convalescence, my mother and I talked. "I don't want you to go," she said. "It's wrong to fly in the face of custom. Each of us has a place, and if we fall out of it, the world will turn upside down. But your father's set on your going now, and you're set on it too. I don't think I'll ever see you again, but I won't withhold my blessing from you." "Thank you, my mother," I said. "I couldn't go without it. But you'll see me again. Don't worry." I told her a story. My mother loved stories. "The summer sun will turn the garden into dust," I said. "Fall will come, and with it the cool winds from the west. Winter rains will fall on the city and fill the canals to the brim. Then spring will be here once more, with the scent of jasmine, and then the dry, dusty summer, and then the cool winds of fall. When the autumn winds blow yet a third time, then I too will come again." My mother shook her head. She didn't believe me. But she accepted my going. She believed in kismet, in fate. What was going to happen would happen. There was nothing anyone could do about it. As for me, I know you can't avoid your kismet, but I also know you can help it along a little. The next day, I covered my face with my hijab, as does any modest woman when she leaves the house. I was being perfectly attentive to custom at the very moment that I was hatching plans to flout it completely. But I didn't think about that irony then. I was too busy to think. I had time only to act. I went to the souk nearest our house, a poor bazaar befitting a poor neighborhood. The narrow, unpaved street was lined on both sides with tiny shops connected to each other beneath a long arcade. It was late. The sun was close to setting, and the tradesmen were beginning to think about home and supper. It was the hour at which to buy goods cheap. The shop of Abu Ishaq sold second-hand clothing. It would be cheaper to make what I needed, but I didn't have the time. I selected wide pantaloons, a vest, a loose-fitting shirt, stockings, pointed shoes, a fez, a white linen money belt, and a handsome striped cotton jubba to cover all, and to cover me too. I told the shopkeeper they were for my brother. "He's about my height," I said. "I think these things will fit him, don't you?" "Certainly, daughter," the stall keeper responded with a little bow. You have a most educated eye, daughter. You selected the finest items I have for sale. They belonged to a rich man's son. He wears a garment once, and then he discards it for a new one. You couldn't have made a better choice." The man was lying. Except for the jubba, all the items I'd picked out had places on them where the material was worn thin with age. But that didn't matter. The jubba, which was in excellent condition, would hide everything else most of the time. "You see, uncle," I pointed out, "you see where the material is worn thin here? The rich man's son must have let his servants wear the clothes before he had them sent over to you." "Impossible," the shopkeeper insisted. "That's just the way the material is woven. You won't find a better piece of good in Baghdad." But his heart wasn't in the bargaining. It was late, and he wanted to get home. I sobbed a little when I told him how poor we were, and how we never thought to see our dear brother again, for poverty had forced us to put him into service with a distant cousin in Damascus. "Then he leaves with the caravan tomorrow?" the stallkeeper asked. "Tomorrow? Tomorrow? Tuesday?" I was glad to discover that a caravan was scheduled to depart the very next day. As my father always said, whatever you wanted to know, you had only to go to the bazaar to find out. "Yes," I said, "the one that leaves tomorrow, from the Khan by Al-Maristan." No, not from the Khan by Al-Maristan, child," the stall-keeper said patronizingly. "It leaves from the Khan at the end of the Souk al-Thalatha, promptly at first light. It's led by Gindar the African, and he's very strict with all who travel in his company." Yes, of course," I agreed. "Gindar the African. We had to give him 2 dinars to take my brother." "2 dinars?" the stall-keeper cried. "2 dinars! I'm through bargaining with you. You're better at it than I am. If your father could persuade Gindar the Strict to take your brother for only 2 dinars, I won't get anywhere with you. Take everything, take it all. Take it for 11 dirhams. 3 dirhams. 9 dirhams. 5 dirhams. 7 dirhams. Done. And done." I bundled the clothes together quickly and left before he could change his mind. I was satisfied. I had acquired a man's entire wardrobe and all the information I needed for only 7 dirhams. I thought my success was a good omen for the future. The next morning I arose long before daybreak. My sisters were still asleep. I hadn't said goodbye to them the night before. They weren't to know that what I was really doing. My mother would tell them later that I'd gone to be a servant in a rich man's house, and that I was so miserable over my fate that I hadn't been able to bring myself to make them a proper farewell. So I said goodbye to each of them as they lay sleeping. I said goodbye in my heart. "Goodbye, Fatima," I thought. "I'll see to it that you find a husband worthy of your loveliness. Goodbye, Zainab. Be a good friend to my father when I'm gone. Goodbye, Khalida. Don't gossip about me when you go to the well, because you won't be telling the truth. Goodbye, Sharifa. Tell my mother to give you the comb and the mirror I left behind. I won't be needing them where I'm going. Goodbye, Amina. Take good care of little Darira, because she is soft-hearted and will cry the most for me when I'm gone." But to Darira, I couldn't say goodbye, not even silently, because I knew that if I did, I'd run over to her and take her in my arms and cover her sweet, tiny face with kisses. She would wake, and the others would wake, and I'd surely miss Gindar the Strict and his caravan. My father and mother were waiting for me in the other room. My mother kissed me. "May God watch over you, my child," she said. Into my hand she pressed a goatskin flask and a packet of flat loaves of bread. She must have stayed up most of the night baking them. There were enough to keep me almost all the way to the coast. That would save me a lot of money. Food was expensive on the caravan. My father had something for me, too. It was the carved white ivory queen from his precious chess set. "The king is lost if the queen is taken," he said. "I won't play chess until you come home again." I put the piece in my money belt. "It's my talisman," I said, "my treasure. As long as I have it, I know I'll be safe." My father kissed me, too, on each cheek. "May God protect you," he said. "May he protect you and shower his blessings upon you." "And upon you, oh my father," I whispered. I kissed them both once again, my mother and my father, and then I left the house as quickly as I could. If I had stayed any longer, my nerve might have deserted me. I hadn't known in advance how hard it was going to be to say goodbye. My dream was coming true, and already I knew that wasn't an unmixed blessing. Though my parents realized I intended to disguise myself as a boy, actually seeing me in men's clothing would have been more of a shock than they could have borne, so I hadn't put on the garments I'd purchased before I said goodbye to them. It was time to put them on now, and since it isn't manly to cry, I forced my tears back of my eyes and wiped from my cheeks the ones that had already fallen. In the courtyard, I hacked off my hair with the scissors. I didn't have to do a perfect job. My felt hat would cover my head completely anyway. Swiftly, I pulled on my new clothes. I left the old ones in a little pile beneath the blooming jasmine. I would have no use for them on my travels, or after I came again, rich and dressed in silk. I left my mother's scissors there, too. Beneath my shirt and vest, I bound my money belt tightly around my waist. A thief would have to murder me to get it, and I wasn't dressed richly enough to be worth murdering. Besides, traveling with Gindar the African was supposed to be safe. Traveling with him would also sadly reduce my store of money, but there wasn't anything I could do about that. I slipped out of the gate, hoping I had at least an hour until first light. I strode swiftly through the narrow, winding streets. Occasionally, a dog barked at me. I passed a woodcutter carrying a load of sticks on his back, and a farmer leading a donkey loaded with palm rib boxes full of chickens. A dairyman with 2 pails yoked over his shoulders jostled me as I went by. It was still dark, but already buyers and sellers from outlying villages had begun to trade. No one gave me a second glance. My disguise was working. I was just a boy, and, like everyone else, merely on my way through the dusty, crooked streets of the Souk al-Thalatha, the Tuesday market, the oldest and longest bazaar on the Rasafa, the eastern side of the Tigris River.